Where the Body Is by Holger Neubauer. Narrated by Michael Trusty. Almost all futurists divide the Olivet Discourse and argue that Jesus referred to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the first part of the sermon, but then transitioned to the end of the physical world in the second part of the address, Matthew chapter 24, verses 35 and 36. They argue that Jesus was answering the disciples' question about the end of the world in the second part of the sermon, in Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 3. But the King James Version's end of the world is much better translated the end of the age. Jesus' sacrifice took place in the end of the world, King James Version, or ages, New King James Version, Hebrews chapter number 9 and the verse 26. Jesus was a Jew living in the Mosaic Jewish age, and no Jew had even an inkling about some end of the geophysical world. The Jews identified their age with their temple and could not even imagine the dismantling of the temple to the very last stone. But that is what Jesus affirmed. Jesus was speaking about the end of their Jewish world, not the planet. Matthew's account contains 3 questions. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 3. All 3 questions that the disciples asked about were directly related to Jesus' statement, "Not one stone shall be left here upon another." Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 2. In Mark's account, the disciples ask, "And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" Mark 13 and the verse 4. Matthew's end of the age and Mark's the sign of all things will be fulfilled are pointing to one fulfillment, not 2. For God would fulfill every jot and tittle of the law and the prophets by the end of the age. Matthew chapter number 5, verses 17 and 18. Jesus mentioned the end in Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 14. The first part of the sermon, not the last. Jesus said, "This gospel shall be preached in all the world, and then the end shall come." Paul affirmed that the gospel had been preached in all the world, whereby I am made a minister by the time in Colossians chapter 1 and the verse 23 was written, setting the stage for the end. Also in the first part of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus said, "For wherever the carcass is, there will be the eagles gathered together." Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 28. Almost all preachers in the churches of Christ affirm that this refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. Yet these same preachers affirm that Luke chapter 17 and the verse 37, which says, "Wherever the body is, the eagles will be gathered together," is a reference to the end of time. They have Jesus speaking about the alleged end of time, because these verses contain the phrase, "There will be one taken and the other will be left." Luke chapter 17, verses 34 through 36, which is found in the alleged second part of Matthew chapter 24, verses 40 and 41. But Luke chapter 17 and the verse 37 and Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 28 have the eagles gathered together, where the body and carcass reside. The body is the carcass, and the carcass is the body. What is a carcass but a dead body? The body and carcass is a reference to the old covenant body of Jews that were judged for rejecting their Messiah. For he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. John chapter 1 and the verse 11. If these events are the same events, not different events as two opponents of mine have affirmed in public debate, then their whole paradigm collapses, and their doctrine is refuted because the New Testament writers draw from Jesus' own words. If the Olivet Discourse is not divided, then all futurist theories, and that's what they are, fail. And Jesus' coming in the destruction of Jerusalem is the second and final coming of Christ. If the alleged end of the world takes place by the planet burning up, then how are the eagles gathered together when the planet is gone? If, however, Jesus is referring to the same event of national judgment of the Jewish nation, Jesus uses these phrases in the same way. And, of course, for those who don't have an agenda, the agreement is obvious, and the conclusion is sure. Jesus returned in the fall of the temple. When Jesus uses the term carcass and body, he's speaking about national Israel as a body of people who had died because of their sin. The New Testament doctrine that speaks of one body, Ephesians chapter 4 and the verse 4, was not a new idea. God's people were always viewed corporately as a body of people. Hosea spoke of Ephraim, who was guilty of Baal worship, and how he died as body of people. Hosea chapter 13 and the verse 1. In Isaiah chapter 10, Assyria was used by God to punish his people and become the rod of my anger. Isaiah chapter 10 and the verse 5. Though Assyria did not realize they were serving God's purpose, for Isaiah said, "He does not mean so." Isaiah chapter 10 and the verse 7. Yet the Lord would use Assyria to kindle a burning like the burning of a fire. So the light of Israel would be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame. It will burn and devour his thorns and briars in one day, and it will consume the glory of his forest and of his fruitful field, both soul and body. And they will be as a sick man wastes away. Isaiah chapter 10, the verses 16 through 18. The phrase soul and body refers to total and complete national judgment of the people of Israel, with just a few escaping. For Isaiah wrote, "Then the rest of the trees of his forest will be so few in number that a child may write them." Isaiah predicted only a few would be left. Though the Lord was behind the judgment, Assyria would be his instrument, and he would thoroughly punish his people, so they would be consumed in both soul and body. Jesus, like Isaiah, used this judgment phrase of soul and body when speaking about the nation of Israel as a collective whole, not of individual judgment at the end of time. Matthew chapter 10 and the verse 28. Matthew chapter 24 and 28 and Luke chapter 17 and the verse 37 refer to the same events, not different events. The phrase one taken and one left have reference to being taken in captivity and being left or spared. Lot and Noah were left because they were spared. It was the wicked that were taken because they were taken into judgment as Sodom and the disobedient of Noah's time were judged. In the Assyrian captivity, Israel was taken into captivity. 2 Kings chapter 17 and the verse 33. And Judah was left alone. 2 Kings chapter 17 and the verse 18. Zechariah predicted the second coming of Christ in Zechariah chapter 14, in which some would be taken and others would be left. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 2 and verse 16. Zechariah's context bears out the same theme. The wicked are taken, the righteous were left. And Zechariah chapter 14 and the verse 7 contains the day known to the Lord, of which Jesus quotes from Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 36, and John announces, had come. At the destruction of Jerusalem, which is in Babylon the Great. Revelation chapter 18, verses 8 and 10. Both Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 17 and Luke chapter 17 and the verse 30 contain the same admonition. He which is on his housetop and his goods in the house, let him not come down to take them away. To be consistent, the futurists have to say that Luke chapter 17 and the verse 30 means at the end of time. And Matthew 24 and the verse 17 refers to the end of the temple system. Both passages have reference to the time of the end, not the end of time. The Bible never uses the phrase end of time. There was only a time of the end. So are preachers warning their members, per Luke, should they be on their housetops at the end of time, that they better not go down to get their goods? For if they do, they will be lost. What nonsense. Jesus spoke those words to the last generation of Jewish Christians who were still living in Palestine, that when the armies of Rome began to encompass the city, they would have to flee to the mountains. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 16. Both Matthew and Luke speak of the same coming of the Lord. The coming of the Lord is singular and not plural. The doctrine in the church that affirms Jesus came in many ways is just as unscriptural as the different salvation doctrines in the denominational world. There was only one second coming of Christ. Hebrews chapter 9 and the verse 28. And there was only one end. The Jews were expecting, and it was the second coming of Christ that would mark that end. That end would be marked by the dead body of Judaism that would have the eagles gathered together, as the temple was dismantled stone by stone. Luke chapter 17 and the verse 37. Matthew chapter 24 and the verse 28. And declared the sign that Jesus returned. The phrase eagles gathered together is an apt description for the Roman armies, for the eagle was their emblem. If the reference is to vultures, as some suggest, then the argument still stands, because how are vultures gathered around the planet if the planet is burned up? And who would see it? Jesus is referencing one event, not two. Oh, that my brothers would understand. I pray they will.